Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome to week 10. This week, we will be talking about pedagogical approaches to documenting children's learning. So the workshop outline, as you can see there on the slide, we've got some very important points to go through. We're going to talk about how documentation is connected to assessment for children's learning, gathering, documenting, and analysis of learning and teaching, the role of pedagogical documentation. So we're going to be referring to Reggio quite a bit there, and the links between documentation and observation, evaluating documentation. We'll talk about collaboration with documentation, so collaboration with children, families, and colleagues. And then we're going to unpack some of our transforming perspectives in terms of some of the more recent research and understandings around children's documentation. And then we will have time to unpack or answer some questions or do some clarification about the assessment task. Okay, so assessment for young children's learning, it refers to the process of gathering and analysing information as evidence about what children know, what they can do, and what they understand. So the 5 learning outcomes that you can see on the slide and the sub-outcomes of the framework, they're the key reference points against which children's progress can be assessed and communicated. So as we've discussed previously, this is part of an ongoing cycle that includes planning, documenting, and evaluation of children's learning. So how this is documented, it's actually a subject of extensive debate in the children's education and care sector in Australia and also internationally as well. So questions about how do we document, how much do we document? These are 2 really common questions. And time constraints, they're often raised as a key challenge for early childhood teachers, especially in those prior to school contexts. So those of you that have had experience in those contexts and are fully aware of the huge amount of documentation that can be involved, it is quite challenging. And I guess another thing that has become more recently significant is the evolution and also the widespread use of digital technologies in terms of documenting of children's learning, such as the impact of devices on meaningful interactions, the respect of children's rights and privacy and communication with parents. So that digital technology use has really made a big difference. It's become quite significant in the last few years. And there are quite a few documentation apps that prior to school settings are using now. And it really has become an expectation of parents to use those digital technology apps. So it's important for us, I guess, to remember that documentation, it's actually a professional responsibility. And there are really no recipes or regulated formulas as to what it should involve. So like many aspects in early childhood education and care, we're very much left to our own devices and to make decisions based on those individual students and families, and of course, we keep coming back to it, the context as well. So the outcome focused standards, they really encourage teachers and educational leaders to use their professional judgment and to be creative and innovative in the way that that children's learning is documented. So again, it comes back to those thoughtful and purposeful decisions. So young children, they demonstrate their learning in many and varied ways, and the early years learning framework, it therefore also encourages varied ways of gathering, documenting, and analysing evidence to assess children's learning and our teaching as well. So there is a big emphasis on documentation and assessment that doesn't focus exclusively on the endpoints of children's learning and of our teaching. So I think we need to think about how equal consideration really does need to be given to those small steps involved in the process of documentation. So things like educators using children's responses and body language to inform our decision making. So it's not all about what's written down or typed into an app. You know, we really need to think about interaction, where interaction and learning experiences might lead. And think about, I guess, how assessment is occurring alongside of learning as well. So there's lots to think about. And as I said, it's again very much dependent on our personal pedagogical beliefs about learning. It's directly related to our decisions and choices on how we document. So documentation and assessing learning in the early years, it enables us in partnership with families and children and other professionals to adopt a range of approaches. So for observing, for gathering and documenting children's learning. So we're encouraged to use evidence to inform our future planning. And we're also encouraged to reflect on the effectiveness of our teaching, to make judgments about children's developing capabilities, and to respond in thoughtful and purposeful ways. So it also makes us aware of the nature of the learning process and the strategies used by very young children. So we also need to engage children as active participants in recording and reflecting on their own learning, and also for them to be encouraged to identify the processes of learning. So importantly, with documentation, a big part of it is strengthening our partnerships with families and to make our teaching visible. This is extremely important in early childhood contexts. You know, teaching needs to be really visible and information needs to be shared. So this makes it possible for parents to really become quite intimately and deeply aware of their children's experiences in the setting and beyond just what they've eaten, you know, nappy changing, who they've interacted with. It needs to be more than that. It needs to be about their learning and their understandings. Because our evaluation, it really holds us accountable for providing appropriate learning opportunities. And for early childhood educators, you know, those of us who are strong advocates for early childhood education, it really strengthens the value and the significance of what we do in the early childhood space. So at the moment, for those of you who are working in prior to school settings or even prep to 3 settings in early primary, what kind of documentation do you currently use in your learning environment to record children's learning? Is there any specific strategies or approaches that you use? Feel free to type into the chat, or you're welcome to verbally share your practices. Anything specific that you focus on? Typo there, sorry about that. So Angela says PM benchmarks for reading. Can you clarify what you mean by that, please, Angela?
Yes, it's to get their reading level. So it checks like what reading strategies they're using. This is for K to 3 context. It checks what reading strategies they're using, what decoding strategies, what their fluency, their comprehension, their retelling ability. And then our school has a tabulated comparison chart as to where they should be for an expected range halfway through the year and towards the end of the year.
Right, so it's fairly data-driven documentation by the sounds of it.
Yep, and then for their writing, we'll do work samples and moderate the work samples all on marking rubrics.
Yeah.
But there's not very much these days, there's not very much tick and flick anymore, like assessing skills, and everything has to be on paper to show parents or the powers that be. You have to have, you kind of, well, we got a new supervisor last year and she did start saying, trust your judgment and trust your knowledge. You don't, a tick and flick is okay for year 1 and 2, you know, if they're demonstrating abilities. But before that, it was very much, you had to have a sample, a writing sample, evidencing anything and everything, really.
Yeah. Well, that's very much the way of it, things like in our QTPA for the 4th years, the final assessment task is very much about assessment for learning, right from early childhood up to secondary. So focusing on having specific examples of students' work. So it really does vary from one school to the next, or one prior to school setting to the next. But having evidence to show is really important at the moment.
We also had, you know, to hand over at the end of the year, we had the SENA assessments, which is their early arithmetic strategies. I found those things were really good at the beginning of the year because you could see exactly where the child left off at the end of the previous year.
Yeah.
You know, writing samples, not so much because a lot happens. But just for the SENA and the reading, it gives you a point of reference to try and organize 26 little people in some sort of ordered learning environment.
Yeah.
Without knowing them in the slightest.
But
in terms of parenting reporting, it was just reports midway and at the end of the year, and then you're face-to-face in your first term.
Interesting. Thank you very much for sharing that. So we've got Kamiko uses StoryPark app for Kindy. That's very popular across lots of prior to school contexts. Tiffany, formative assessment, so work samples, videos, learning stories, jottings, and summative assessment statements periodically. So what do the summative assessment statements involve, Tiffany?
So that's looking generally every sort of 4 months, like looking over the formative assessment that has been collected, the formative been collected for the child over that period, and then writing, I guess, around about a paragraph about how that child has progressed in that learning outcome, which is usually associated with a goal.
Yes.
Yeah. So
Interesting.
a summary of the formatives, really.
Yeah. And Sonia uses another app, the OWNA app. And Fiona's Kindy, we use an A3 visual diary in each room that records the learnings with no mention of specific children. And then observations in folders, which are used for planning. And then each child has a journal portfolio and portfolio of work and observations. That's a fairly, the journal entries are very popular as well. But a lot of my students that are going out on their prior to school placements, Fiona, they're finding that the journals are disappearing, and the use of Storypark and online assessment, online documentation is becoming very popular. Tiffany, floor books as documentation. Do you want to clarify what you mean there?
Oh, so I think I mentioned this before. It's an idea that comes from Claire Warden, who talks about like following children's lines of inquiry using floor books. So it might be like a big scrapbook, and it might have samples of the children's work and their ideas and their thoughts about certain things, their questions, and then, over time finding answers to those questions. And so, yeah, it documents their learning journey, I guess.
Yeah, excellent. And then Pamela says that her son's kindy used Explore last year, and the previous kindy had a portfolio for each child featuring a lot of evidence of the children's achievements. Yeah, my son had a portfolio as well, and he's 16 and he still pulls it out every now and then and has a look at it. It's, it's got photos of all of his old little mates and examples of his first attempts at writing, all of those sorts of special things. So they're very treasured in our household, and I'm sure they are in many. And I guess if you're moving on to electronic apps and things, I'm not sure if I can't imagine that they would be printing them out, but I suppose you could if you wanted to create your own booklet. But there is a certain delight, as we can see on the slide there, with the boys looking at their portfolios. It's very special. Numeracy and language apps. Yep, so Yifang's nephew's kindergarten, they use an app too. Is that in China?
Yes, and this app is specific for these kindergarten teachers to use it.
Right. And so is that a specific one, or is it one that's commonly used in private school settings?
No, it's the specific one, because my nephew's kindergarten is private, and it's a private kindergarten. It's not the public kindergarten, so maybe their documents ways is different from the public. Yeah.
My niece and nephew, my brother's family, they don't live in China at the moment, but their kindy over there, every day they would get so many photos of what the children were doing. So there are lots of emphasis on providing parents with mainly photos, I think it was. Yeah.
Because in China's one duty is for the Chinese kindergarten teachers, their duty is to take the pictures for every children. Because if you miss some children, and the parents will feel angry and they will argue with that, why my children don't have the next pictures or something. Yeah, so this is something is pay more attention for the kindergarten teachers to taking photos rather than to take care of the children or organizing the activities. So it's very hard to balance it.
That's interesting, because like I said before, it's sort of become a bit of an expectation. And Kiri, one of our internal students, she was saying that when kindergarten students move into prep, she's a prep teacher, she said that there is that expectation there as well. They really want to see photos and have information about what their students are doing. So I think it's a little bit of a, I don't know, it's a change of pace for parents in terms of documentation when they move from prior to school settings to prep. It's interesting. So Story Park has a wonderful resource to access your child's daily learning. It looked like an enormous amount of work for teachers, though. It is, Angela. It can be huge. And as Yifang said, often you have staff that are just dedicated to doing the documentation in that regard. So Fiona says, we find a hard copy book is great for the children to look at and revisit by themselves or with peers, and they can't do this with an online app. I have to agree with you there, Fiona. And Jade said in the UK, she used Tapestry app for reception, so Prep Age. We uploaded pictures and videos of children completing their activities or their work samples with observation notes linking to the learning outcome. Okay, so very much involved, way beyond just images. So work samples, so it sounds like they're annotated as well. So you found the app very helpful as it generated data on each child and their progress. So did you find that was a lot of work?
Yeah, it was huge. It was my second year teaching, so I think I went probably too far with it. I was up every night watching TV at like 8 o'clock, well, not really watching TV. The TV's on, just like uploading 8, 9 o'clock at night, uploading all the observations, because we'd have focused children, 6 focused children a week, and we try and do like an observation in each learning area for each of those children, every day or two. So it was a lot of work. I had 30 kids in my class as well.
Wow.
But I did have a school officer or teaching assistant who did a bit of documentation, because I didn't want to be sitting there on my iPad during the day. So I would just write notes quickly on a Post-it note and do it all like when I wasn't with the children, because I wanted to be with the children, not behind a screen.
I can imagine. We're going to talk about this quite a bit moving through the workshop. We're going to talk about next steps with documentation as well, because we find that there is a lot of documentation, but some of it just sits there and nothing's actually done with it. So, and there's a lot of work put into that. So it's important that, you know, those next steps are considered.
We got to use it a lot. Like we did a lot of interest-driven learning. So we would like plan the next day. If someone did something, we'd set up an activity based around an interest that they'd shown or a group of children had shown. So it was nice to see that follow through. I think that was my favorite year of teaching, even though it was so much work. It was so play-based and inquiry-based learning, and I loved it.
Wonderful. And see, that makes documentation all the more fun and exciting as well, if it is meaningful. Tiffany believes that we should pull back on educators taking photos as so they can spend more time with the children, but we need parents to understand why this is necessary. Yep, again, it's coming back to educating parents about our practices. Really important, Tiffany. So Kamiko, oh, that's interesting. Kamiko says that they print pages from Story Park and display them at the front entrance, so grandparents who do not use smartphones can see what is happening at the kindy and what their grandchildren are doing. Oh, that's interesting. I like that. On the Blackboard activities for this week, the pre-workshop activities, I actually had an article about using digital technology for documentation. So we might have a bit of a chat about that later if any of you got to have a read of it. Thank you so much for sharing you know, the documentation that you currently use in your practice. It really gives a good you basis for what we're going to be talking about in the workshop.
Angela, can I just ask a question? It's Natalie.
Yeah.
I've not worked in prior to school early childhood settings at all, and so lots of this is just new to me, and it seems like it's really varied in terms of documentation from centre to centre, and I'm wondering if there is any basis to like what you have to produce in terms of documentation. Like, so in an early childhood school setting, you would still be providing their end of semester reports, you know, good or bad, those A to E kind of reports still go home to parents, and that is like a set documentation that happens across all primary schools. Is there anything that like this is kind of like at least what you have to provide in the prior to school early childhood settings, or is it completely up to each centre to decide what they do?
Well, to be accredited to in terms of the National Quality Framework, spaces need to have documentation, so observations on individual students. There needs to be links to the curriculum frameworks, and it has to be for individual students. So centres need to be differentiating for individuals. So yes, there's definitely a requirement, and there are spot checks, and depending what grading you've received, you may have more checks than others, but yeah, there's definitely guidelines that prior to school settings have to follow. But
yeah, okay.
It will vary, the devices that they use, the methods that they use, very influenced by the individual settings' pedagogical beliefs. So some settings may not choose not to use digital documentation. For example, a lot of Montessori centres, there is less focus than other centres on the use of electronic apps. So it really does vary.
Okay, all right, thank you.
That's okay, good question. So I like these images. I love sharing images that I collect of children's artwork and the displays, documentation displays. So I guess documentation as communication involves using all those wonderful transcriptions of children's conversations, their remarks, annotated photographs of ongoing work and activities, and the creations that have been produced by the children that actually represent their thinking and learning. So teachers commentaries on the purposes of a project, along with those transcripts of the children's verbal language, photographs, representations, all of those things are provided in learning stories or journals designed to present those processes of learning. So the history, I guess, because as we know, children in these settings develop so quickly, and it's very exciting to see how they progress and how their understandings develop. So these documentations, it also shows children that their work is valued, and it makes parents aware of individual and group learning experiences, and it allows teachers to assess both their teaching and also the children's learning. So the documentations I've chosen to share here, they're at child height, as you can see. They're not, parents would have to crouch down very low to actually see what's going on. Why do you think this is the case here? Why do you think they're at child height? Any thoughts? What is it saying?
Hi. It's saying that their ideas are valued and their opinions valued, and look what you've done. It's legitimate and it's real and it's good enough to go on display for everyone to see because, it's awesome,
Yeah, definitely. I think so. And the way that it's designed here, for me, it's designed so that children can stand together and share and discuss what they see. So it's really very much collaborative pedagogy, I think, and I love that. So they're not created to serve primarily as decorations or ways of showing off the work. It's about really taking children's work seriously, and it encourages them to approach their work responsibly, and it really reinforces the idea that their work is considered important. So yeah, I would definitely agree with that. It's Angela, it's and eventually it becomes a historical archive, and it traces the pleasure and the joy and the process of children's and teachers' learning experiences as well. And it really does show you that process of learning. And it's quite intimate in a lot of ways as well, I think. Yeah. So for children, Fiona says, so the children can revisit their learnings. Jade says to provide ownership to children of their learning. And Pamela adds, making learning visible. Excellent. Yeah, all really important. But they're very thoughtfully displayed as well, and beautifully displayed as well. So quality documentation, it makes it possible to create knowledge as both teachers and researchers. So documentation is a form of research. So I think we can identify 5 important features of documentation that you can see there on the slide. So documentation involves a specific question that guides the process, often with an epistemological focus, so a focus on questions of how students are learning and how they're thinking. It involves collectively analysing and interpreting and evaluating individual and group observations. So, it's really strengthened by those multiple perspectives. And by multiple perspectives, we would be considering the children, the parents, and all of the educators in the learning space. So it makes use of multiple languages, so different ways of representing and expressing thinking, so in various media and symbol systems. So, and of course, as we said, it makes learning visible. It's not private. Documentation becomes public when it's shared with learners, whether it's with children, parents or teachers. And also I think it's important that to remember that it's not only retrospective, it's also prospective. So it shapes the design of future contexts for learning. Again, it comes back to that moving forward. So making those thoughtful and purposeful decisions about the next steps in children's learning. So pedagogical documentation, it could be described as visible records, so written notes, photos, videos, audio recordings, children's work samples. So all of these things, they enable educators, parents and children to discuss, to interpret and reflect about what has happened, what is happening and what might happen in the future as well. And it's also about what's happening from varied points of view. So pedagogical documentation, it supports decision making about the best way to proceed. So I guess believing that rather than being an unquestionable truth, there are many possibilities with what we observe and document with children's learning. Yeah, so it really does, depending on how we do it, it can support our philosophy as children of our philosophy of children as being active, capable, and competent learners. Importantly, it allows children to evaluate their own work through revisiting it over and over again. And of course, it's that historic aspect as well. And it also, looking at this particular image here, I think it encourages parents to rethink their view of the image of the child as well. You know, the image of them as being capable and competent and active learners. Yeah, and I guess it comes down to our planning of the curriculum, so decisions about curriculum content as well. That's a major part of documentation, especially in terms of pleasing the powers that be, which is always something that we need to consider. So observation and documentation are very closely linked. Observation, it needs to go beyond interpretation to planning those next steps, so the what next, and around making decisions about how to extend a young child's learning and their thinking based around those determined learning outcomes. You know, and we talk about documentation as being really important, but often these decisions are more than, you know, most of the time, I think they're made in the moment. So sometimes there isn't a lot of documentation involved. So children's learning, it's spontaneous, and much of it isn't documented. You know, we can do anecdotal records and things like that to document, you know, some specific learnings, but there are some learnings that aren't quite as visible as others. And that's especially in very young children, in, you know, the birth to 2 environment. This is a really important space in terms of documentation, because I think a lot of educators in that space need to have a really good understanding of child development and to be very insightful about what they're observing. I think that's vital. My birth to 2 undergraduate students, they have to do their child development before they go out on their first placement, because it's a major part of it. And I always say to them, if you can observe in a birth to 2 environment, you can observe anywhere, because, you know, you really have to look so carefully, because it's not about language, it's about body language, it's about the things, not just what they do, but what they don't do as well. It's really fascinating and not easy. I think those observation in that younger years is very difficult. So teachers, you know, they routinely take notes and photographs and make recordings of group discussions and of children's play. And if we take the Reggio pedagogical approach as an example, as we discussed in week 6, teachers would meet each week to focus on children's observations. And that's a really important part of documentation, you know, reviewing the documentation and striving to hear the strongest currents of interest within the children's flow of ideas. So in Reggio, they would then use what they've learnt from the observations, and they would plan activities and inquiry-based projects that are truly based on the interests of the children. So to really gain insights into their individual personalities and into child development as a whole. So we didn't talk too much about documentation in when we talked about Reggio, but it is very much about documentation as a pedagogy. So children's voices lie at the heart of consulting with children. So by children's voices, I mean how they express meaning, so verbally, through the visual arts, through dance, through movement, song, poetry, photography, drawing, all sorts of multimedia, drama, writing. So I guess we're talking here about Malaguzzi's 100 Languages of Children, really. So we really need to make sure that children have as many varied possibilities and opportunities to channel their voices. So through multiple modes, because some children may prefer to express their meanings in different ways. So we need to take that into consideration. And as well, we need to think about the diversity of our learners as well. Note that what we're doing, our documentation, it reflects their interests, their needs, their strengths, their cultures, their language, their life stories, so their backgrounds as well. And I think we need to, in terms of when we're talking about apps and technology and things as well, to make sure that all parents have access to these as well. So, you know, to make sure that there are no biases there in terms of what parents have access to, what parents, and I liked the example with grandparents as well. So printing out Story Park images so that grandparents that possibly don't use devices have the opportunity to see what their grandchildren are doing. So when we're documenting the voice of children, we're acknowledging their individual knowledge and perspectives at that particular point in time. So this direct knowledge, it allows educators to gain an insight into the child's thinking and development, and to deeply consider how to intentionally engage with that child. And this is very much what happens in that birth to two space. So really intentionally thinking about what the child is thinking and learning, which takes very, very good observation and active listening skills as well. It's a really unique responsibility to make sure that we are engaging with very young children, and we're considering about, you know, what a child is actually thinking and learning. So I think to confidently record children's ideas in a variety of ways, it really gives us the chance to reflect on their practice, on our practice and the children that we educate. So I guess it's also considering what tools we might use as well. So, you know, considering things like voice recording, annotating photos, annotating work samples, doing running records, anecdotal records, jottings. So, you know, running records aren't quite so popular anymore because it takes so much time, but I'm still a big advocate for them if you have a situation where you really want to look at a particular skill that a child's developing. So documenting that through a running record, I think, can be very helpful, especially if it's over a period of time, or if it's to do with, you know, a child interacting with a group, so developing social skills, or a child having difficulty with separation from a parent. So often running records can be very helpful in those particular situations. Do any of our prior to school educators here still use running records in those situations? Does anyone use them? I'm just curious because I used them a lot when I was a beginning teacher. No?
Yeah, we would encourage that to use a running record, but if they had noticed something specific, Angela, like so maybe they had used a range of observations and they might have looked at a developmental checklist, and you know that milestones, and you know that checklist has got the milestones and the learning outcomes that came out. Yeah, so that might sort of indicate to them to kind of dig a bit deeper.
Yeah.
So they might do a running record if it was around speech or I don't know, gross motor skills, just to sort of see what more.
Yeah. That's interesting. Fiona's moving with the times. She used to use running records, but now she would probably video the evidence. Of course you would. And Pamela says the only running records that she's ever done have been for reading in years prep to 2. Yeah. I often, that was something that I would get parents to do as well in reading groups, to use them as a resource because it's very time consuming. So Fiona says particularly videoing if the information was going to the paid pediatrician for an assessment. Angela says, I didn't know there was another type of running record other than reading. Oh yeah. Do running records on absolutely anything. And they're not easy to do in terms of you have to really just what you see and what you hear. And that isn't always easy. We can't have any, it's not about reflecting on what you're seeing. It's actually stating the facts. Okay, so our annotations of children's drawings. This is something that I've always been very passionate about. And so they really help to capture the additional meanings that children wish to communicate. And this comic strip, it was created by a 4-year-old child with scaffolding and support from their educator. So after the images were completed, the child worked with the teacher to capture this oral narration that accompanied each of the pictures. So what are your thoughts on talking to children about their creations, about their, it doesn't have to just be drawings, it could be about any form of artwork or creation. What do you think about talking to them about it? Any thoughts? Angela loves it, yes.
I think it gives them validation. I think it makes them feel so much like you value what they're doing and the learning that's happening in that process. I think it certainly is. I can't recall as a young child, my teacher talking to me about the work that I'd done. She probably did, but if I think about how their eyes light up when you go up to them and ask them what they're drawing and what they're doing. And I really loved my boys' books that came home from kindy with their drawings and how the teacher had done the written annotations on them. They're just beautiful. Yeah. And again, something that we'll treasure, just like you are for your son.
Yes, most definitely, definitely. When I remember when I was at QUT many years ago, ladies, when I was studying, I had a wonderful lecturer called Barbara Piscatelli, and she was the specialist art teacher, and I learned so much from her. She was amazing, but she was very conscious, and I noted what Tiffany said here, that she thinks it's essential if they want to. And this is a really good point, because a lot of the time we would avoid saying things like, what have you drawn? I think we need to be using language, things like, would you like to tell me about your drawing? I guess it's about asking, it's almost like asking permission to discuss it with children, because sometimes it's personal. And sometimes if we ask them what their drawing is, they feel obliged to make something up. And sometimes it might just be an exploration of color or line or space. Or so I think we have to be very careful how we instigate discussion. Fiona says that she asks, is there a story that goes with this? As sometimes they are just exploring something. Example, colour mixing, not telling a story. There you go. We're on the exact same wavelength, Fiona. So yeah, definitely, giving them the space to just create or draw for the sake of it. Helen says, I think that is the moment where you really capture what the child is trying to express. Yeah, maybe we were in Barbara's classes together. I don't think so, Fiona. I think I was there a long time ago. I know she's not teaching anymore though. I recently had the same experience, says Tiffany, with someone who put their idea onto to creation, and I was annoyed as an adult. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, so you can empathize with them. Oh, Kamika says Barbara Piscatelli had an exhibition at South Bank, Big Voices, Children Art Matters. It might be still on. It was amazing. Excellent. I missed that. I need to go and have a look. Yes. Okay, well, we could talk about this for ages, but we need to move on. So I think visual documentation is central to making learning visible through pedagogical documentation. So a photo and its annotation, it clearly marks the beginning of a learning inquiry, and it inspires the process of reflection about what children are thinking. So a photograph, it conveys and it provokes meaning, and they hold the same subjective interpretive potential as words, with the opportunity to share diverse meanings and to co-construct new understandings. So if we look at this photo, it's it's a freeze frame of a moment in time, and it may be something that you click, and as an educator you can study it more closely, and you might want to ponder its original intentions. It might be a way of constructing new knowledge about the child, and it might get you to rethink your ways of knowing about what a child is doing as well. So what might this image, for example, tell us about the child? What might the child, we're assuming this. So, what might the child be thinking, doing, reasoning, learning? Any thoughts?
I'll jump in, Angela.
Go for it. Go for it. Nothing's wrong. That's a good thing.
Oh, good. Yeah, look, I think she's finally discovered that the little eyedropper will suck up some water.
So we're talking here about, that she's making inferences, reasoning about how things might happen. So cause and effect, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. even something as simple as, you know, using the pincer grip as well.
Well, it looks like she's squeezing it because it looks indented. So,
Yes.
and I think I can see some water in that dropper. So I think she's worked it out.
Yeah. Pamela says, totally engaged. She really appears to be concentrating very hard on the task. Yeah. So, you know, it shows us that that child can really focus, that she's developing how to, you know, experimenting or working out how to use tools, and that understanding of cause and effect, and developing that pincer grip, that early pincer grip as well. So as they say, a picture tells 1,000 words. This is another image that I really like. Pamela saying, I'm wondering if there's vinegar in the bowl, any bicarb on the tray. I was thinking that too. Let's go back, have a look. That would be great. Quite possible. Oh, yeah. Imagine the change in her face there, the wonder. So this one, what do you think this image says about documentation? Any thoughts? It's really, it's documenting a child documenting their own learning. And Fiona says, the child controls when the documentation occurs, and they are saying what is important. So Sharon's saying as well, it allows the child to decide what is important. And Pamela, using technology to record learning, the child really taking charge of the whole process. Yeah, I like that. So, you know, we're really seeing that children, it's giving, empowering them to share their thinking and their knowledge. And in a lot of ways, it's giving them a lot of freedom. And Tiffany, I love that. It's reflexivity. Do you want to expand on that, Tiffany? I like that.
So I keep turning my video off because I've got a bit of a headache.
Oh, no.
So not from you, they're just the day. Yeah, I actually find it real. I actually saw that image and thought that's what reflexivity is, because it's a really hard concept to get your head around. I think, like in terms of a learning disposition, it depends how familiar with the learning dispositions, but you know, we talk about cooperation and imagination, and reflexivity is always in the bottom, and everyone kind of goes reflexivity, like, you know, not really knowing what it means. And I think it is about the child being able to understand that they can learn and how they learn, and recognizing that you're documenting your own learning. I think that is reflexivity. I don't know. Let me know if I'm wrong.
No, I agree. You know, it is higher order thinking there.
Yeah.
I do believe that too. Yeah. River on so many levels as well.
And this,
yes.
Oh, sorry. This has just reminded me, having my little friend come and sit over here. They photograph their spelling test their pre-test every week. And in that, they post their extension words and any words that they got wrong onto Seesaw. And they do their same with the maths review on a Friday.
Oh.
And they bring it home to show us that. And that's in year 2. So that's quite, and that's all on the Seesaw app.
Yeah.
But that's quite good for them to be aware of what they need to be doing for the next week for the spelling.
Yeah.
I'm just taking it, you know,
a physical documentation.
Yeah, and then it gets gets sent to my phone, obviously, and then they can grab my phone and just remind themselves what their words are. Just that little girl taking a photo of what she'd done with the billy can in the back.
Yeah.
You know, obviously they're learning about there's Aboriginal studies or something around Melbourne happening there. Yeah, and I just, just thought I'd share that.
No, that's great. It's excellent. There are so many really innovative ways and creative ways that we can use documentation, and having children and students at the center of it as well. And
even their sports, actually, they'll video each other doing hurdles.
Yeah.
And then post it to Seesaw. Didn't you? Yeah. Yeah, and it was just really good. They could show the parents how they did, what they did. And then they had to, like how they do the start, you know, the different techniques they can do.
Yeah.
And then they came home and I was like, oh, what's this? And they're like, oh, yes, we can practice it, you know.
Yeah.
And then they went into the backyard and practiced it, which was quite effective.
And documenting developing new skills and improving as well.
Yeah.
I love it. So Fiona says it also shows that sometimes the boards provided with the clay don't provide enough space. Yeah. And it seems like this is the first time she's used the iPad camera because she didn't include everything, all of the clay in the shot. That's interesting too. Yeah. So it's about developing, you know, understanding how to use devices as well. And that might involve some explicit instruction possibly from the educator, or it may involve the child experimenting with how to use it. Often if we show children how to do things explicitly, it stifles their creativity. I know I've got, when my son was very young, I used to leave my little camera lying around the place all the time, and every now and then, this is when I used to get photos printed out, I'd look at the photos and it was like from a 2-year-old's perspective, you know, looking up at things, or, you know, it's just fascinating. So having children photograph things as well, it really does allow us to see their perspective, literally. So it's very interesting. Okay, so I just want to, I mainly have these examples for those of you who are either here or watching the recording that possibly haven't had a lot of experience in the prior to school settings. So I just wanted to show you a documentation of a learning example, so with annotated photos. So you can see here that the educator has referenced the early years learning framework principles. Actually, this would be interesting for you, Natalie. So this is what the expectation would be. Reference the early years learning framework principles, practice, and learning outcome 1. So the initial objective observation, so it supports the subjective photo, stating exactly what happened without subjective interpretation. That's very important with observations, that the initial observation is objective. So included is the description of the spontaneous teachable moment and the sustained shared interaction. So in that birth to 2 setting. So the educator has then analysed the observed learning and their understanding of the child's development. So under what next, I'm not sure what you can see there, if that's made any difference. Under what's next, the educator has identified future planning opportunities to follow up with, so the what next. And we can also see their personal pedagogical beliefs about teaching and learning. as well as direct links to the curriculum document utilised in the context. So engaging with and with the child, identifying and taking advantage of that teachable moment. And you can see here as well with the reflection that the educator actually has a good understanding of child development to support their teaching, with a high expectation of the child's understanding there as well. So this example is from a pre-service teacher. So on placement. And then this one, we've got quality area 1 of the National Quality Standards. So the aim is to ensure that the educational program and practice is stimulating and engaging and enhances children's learning and development. So you can see the progression there. So curriculum decision-making is key here. It contributes to each child's learning and their developmental outcomes in relation to their identity, connection with community, well-being, confidence as learners, and effectiveness as communicators. So directly related to the early years learning framework. So you can see in the planning example where the links have been made to the early years learning framework outcomes and to pedagogical approaches, reflection, and importantly, evaluation of the teaching and learning. So you've got the host teacher's feedback there as well. And very much a focus on differentiating for individual children. And this is even based on prior observations as well. So a lot of depth and information in there. So our second years, this would be, looks like a kindergarten placement. I like the way they've de-identified the students with the flowers on their faces. So yeah, so this would be second years going in. So as you can see, there's a lot of detail needed in early years planning, with lots of links to curriculum and to those pedagogy, the pedagogy as well. They're also encouraged to make links to theory as well, as you can see there. The self-reflection, just made a link to Filari 2007. And on the slide here, I've got, this is something that I share with my students as well, just some provocations to assist them in their pedagogical decision making. So, you know, thinking about, you know, often they say, well, what do I observe? What can I focus on? Because there's so much. So having a provocation sometimes can help. So how do children interact with each other? What strategies do children use to engage each other and adults? How do children communicate? So use language, verbal, non-verbal. How are children using their bodies? Especially in those birth to 2 spaces, how are they developing an awareness of their bodies? How do they embrace music? Where do they spend time in the learning environment, and why do you think that is? And of course, how do children manage conflict? So lots of provocations to think about in early childhood environments. So like all of our pedagogical choices and practices, we need to ensure we evaluate their effectiveness and also the integrity of our decision making as well. So this needs to be ongoing, it needs to be collaborative, and it needs to be critical. So when evaluating our choices about documentation, we need to think about all of these important things. So whose ideas and actions have been documented? So are your observations objective, or are you making judgments and interpretations in your observations? Whose ideas and actions are missing? So possibly the parents' perspectives in your developmental interpretations. So infants may display milestones at home that are not evident in the learning environment, something that we need to consider. Whose voices are heard? So thinking about who has the power, what are the main ideas emerging in the documentation of learning? So power, as we've discussed before, it's a key consideration when engaging with children's voices. You know, after all, they're the voices that really count, and it's important to be mindful of power. So, you know, making sure that we're not putting words into children's mouths, you know, all those sorts of things. And I guess the power dynamics between children as well. Those children that tend to dominate more than others, and really considering that as well. So meaning making, so working with the child requires techniques such as projection. So, you know, asking questions that explicitly invite children's views. So things like, what do you like about something? How do you feel about something? What makes you think that? What makes you feel that way? So asking leading questions is important. Making sure that children have hands-on experiences, all of those sorts of things. What further questions do we have about children's thinking? So are we encouraging independence and autonomy in skill development and in understandings? What theories may children have or be developing? And, you know, are they challenging these as well? From a very young age, we can start encouraging them to question and challenge what they see and what they hear. It's really important. What can we learn about the way children look, act, and think? So are we looking beyond verbal to non-verbal? What relationships and connections are children making? So how can we enhance, support, and importantly, extend these? And I think one that is often forgotten, being mindful of children's privacy. So as we've discussed before, where possible, consulting children about displaying or keeping their artwork or sharing their interpretations, maybe explaining why you're collecting work samples, or if it's okay to collect work samples, and what you're actually going to do with them as well. So again, that says a lot about how we respect children. I remember Barbara Piscatelli was very insistent that when instead of actually writing descriptions on children's learning, or even their names on children's learning, that we would, if the children were able to, we would get them to write something on a strip of paper, or we would write something as well if they wanted to share something, and we would display it below the child's artwork rather than on the child's artwork. So again, it's another way of showing your respect for what they're doing. All of those little things really count. I guess it's easy for us not to realize the significance of some of those things, but for children, it may be really important. You know, having worked so hard on a piece of art and then someone coming and writing on it. You know, for me personally, I wouldn't like someone doing that to my artwork. So really thinking about where they're, what they're thinking, what their perspectives are. All right, so we have talked about collaboration a lot, but documentation, it really does foster collaboration among all participants. So children, teachers, and parents, they all need to be part of the collection and use of documentation. So children, for example, they might compare and analyze photographs or drawings and previous conversations. They might do this to determine the direction of their inquiry projects. Something that an important factor in Reggio inquiry projects. So using documentation to assist children in how they might want to move forward or make changes or adaptations. Yeah, so it really provides opportunities for parents to engage. Often it can be a struggle to get parents to engage. Often parents, as we know, they drop and run or may have other family members or friends collect the children. So we have to think creatively about how parents can access documentation. So that article that I included this week in the pre-workshop activities, it was about the use of mobile documentation platforms. Did anyone get the chance to have a look at that? It was a study.
I read some of it, but not all of it.
No, I didn't read all of it either.
But as I was reading it, I thought, oh, wow, yeah, well, I immediately kind of tried to apply it to my own situation and thought about my husband and myself with Explore last year with our youngest son. And now he would be like, la, 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 whatever. And I'd be, oh, did you see this? And did you read that? And oh, they did this fantastic activity. And it wasn't that he didn't care, but I don't know, somehow the mums just seemed to be really drawn into it. Yeah. Yeah, I did find it interesting.
Yeah, I did too, because with all of those, very long articles, I tend to read the abstract and I look at the data collection and then I go to the findings to break it down. But yeah, I thought it was really, significant about how the use of the mobile app in particular, it really increased the father's engagement with their children, because it was an interactive app where there was a function to ask questions as well. And so fathers at work could ask a particular question about what their child was doing during the day, with often, for some reason, mums predominantly being the ones who tend to pick their children up, in my experience anyway. So I thought that was very interesting, an interesting bit of research. I have missed some of the chat. Fiona says that you've reminded me of a child that was in my group who did not speak, who would at kindy, I was concerned that she had a huge language delay, but after talking to the parents, I discovered she would stay quiet at home, that she wouldn't stay quiet at home. The parents' input is really important, definitely. Yeah, often we don't see the full extent of a child's development, especially if they only come in a couple of days a week and they're not feeling confident in the space. Fiona says that there's a bit, she finds that interesting, and that we have a child at our school who refuses to speak to many people. According to the parents, she's very verbal at home and it makes it exceedingly difficult to assess him. Yeah, very interesting. Yeah. When my child had to go to the speech therapist, he would not talk, so I recorded him at home and then played it for them to listen to. Maybe the child's parents could do a similar thing. That's interesting. Okay, so we're nearing the end. I just we had there was a clip. I'm not sure how many of you got the opportunity to have a look at it, but it was the one documentation transforming our perspectives, and it was good. It was, Reggio again. We had Rinaldi there speaking about pedagogical documentation. So I've got some prompts there. So have a read of them. And if you did get the opportunity to have a look at it, if you wanted to share some of your insights, that would be appreciated. I'll give you a moment to have a look through. I first saw this clip a few years ago, but when I originally watched it, I really had a bit of a leap in my understanding about documentation. I think, you know, I really grasped that documentation, it's more than, you know, a record, more than just retelling. You know, it really made me think about that if it was done effectively, it really can offer an insight into children's thinking, you know, their understandings, their worldviews, and the meaning of events for them, which I actually thought was really interesting, that, you know, expressing really what they're thinking. It made me really rethink about how I read and observe children's learning in a lot of ways, you know, thinking that it's much more than a process of recording acts. It's really a process of inquiry, which I found interesting. Anything else? Anything that anyone wanted to share? What I might even get you to do, if you wanted to watch it and then add some notes to the Padlet on Blackboard. I'd really like to hear some of your perspectives. I know a lot of you have got so much on. I don't expect you to do all of the pre-workshop activities, just those that you can get to. Okay, so maybe add some points to the Padlet if you get the opportunity. So here we are at our good old assessment support. So any specific questions? I've got some points there, and a lot of these points, because I've been having individual Zoom sessions with some of you, those of you that might have had some specific questions or concerns, or those that aren't working in a teaching position at the moment and are having some difficulties. I'm very, very happy if you want to book an individual Zoom session, if you need assistance, just email me and we'll book a time. On Tuesday night, I think I finished my lecture at 5 and I did 3 after that, just in that time after work. So Tuesday afternoons after 5 are a really good time, if that suits anyone, any of you that need to have a chat, you know, face to face, just the two of us. And what I did for a lot of all of these students is I could screen share their previous assessment task. So maybe break down a few issues, or these were mainly students that needed to rework their research question or possibly their implications for practice.
And sorry, just on implications. So when we're doing our next assignment, is that that's what we're doing? We're using for. So I had 3 implications.
Yeah.
But so do I do like 3 different directions for professional development?
You don't have to do all 3, you can choose. So they might be implications for your particular practice. But if you look down, if you've got the task sheet there, Angela, if you look at the third dot point in part A, it says personal practice, personal goals, personal ambition. And that's what I have here. Make sure you have achievable goals to base your action plan on. So from the implications, you would then turn those into goals that, you know, of course, you wouldn't want to have too many goals. You may just want to focus on one or two, depending on what they are. And those goals then turn into, you know, the basis of your action plan for your professional learning.
Okay.
As I said, if you're kind of feeling a bit stuck or you just need to talk it out, I'm very happy for us to have a Zoom session. Does that help, Angela?
Yes, it does. Because yes, it does. I just need to think about it some more.
You need to think of what they are. Yeah.
Yes. Yes, it does.
Yeah. So
I might Zoom you. Maybe it doesn't.
email me and we'll organize a session. Is Tuesday night good for you, Angela?
Yeah, yes. After
5,
after
sometime after.
Yeah.
Normally between 5 and 8 is probably good for me.
Yep, that'll be good.
Yeah. So just email me, you organize a time.
Okay, thank you.
And we discussed, I can't remember who it was that asked the question about where the theory should be in the assessment task. Who was that? Before the recording started.
It was me.
Seems like, oh,
lots of people are interested in that. All right, it was me, yeah. So, you know, in terms of theory, that first part, the rationale, the introduction is where you would be restating your research question, and you might outline some specific research that you outlined in your rationale in your first assignment. So why your particular focus is so important, what key ideas were raised in your critical analysis of the literature and curriculum frameworks in assessment 1, what plan of action will you put into place for your ongoing professional development in this way? Consider using the following 3 subheadings. So that's what, you know, your life history, your professional history, and your professional practice. And it's got really detailed, you know, dot points or guides to help you with that. Any questions about that part A, that first part? It's pretty straightforward. I've written here that the task is about where you have come from, where you are now, and where you want to go through in your professional teaching practice. You know, we're talking about how you are a change agent in your particular learning environment. So this will be based on your new knowledge from your review of literature and the analysis of the curriculum framework. So that new knowledge and the implications that new knowledge around your research question will have on your particular context. So for those of you who are currently working as teachers, on your context now, for those of you who may have worked as a teacher in the past, but you're not working now, you may want to reflect on your previous context, or those that aren't teaching at the moment, you can imagine a context, or some of you are working in possibly a workplace where you are assisting teachers, and I've talked to those students individually. I think I have talked to all of them. If I haven't talked to you and you're watching the recording, email me and we'll have a Zoom session. But you know, it says here that it needs to be in a birth to 8 years of age range. That's not the case. I'm grading this assessment task and I'm saying I want it to be contextual. I want it to have meaning for you. So if you are working somewhere and you know, you might be policy or working as a consultant to assist teachers or something like that, I want this assessment task to be as real for you as possible. So there's always a way, I believe, to make it work. Any questions, specific questions that I can help you with? So that,
Hi.
yeah.
Sorry, Angela. Yeah. Because my question is about the transitions from kindergartens to primary school in China. So should I writing the reasons why I choose these questions in the professional, in the parts of your professional histories, this part? Should I write the why should, where is the questions come from?
Yes.
Okay.
The answer to that question is yes. So it says here, you might talk about what attracted you to teaching, major influences on your thinking about teaching, including theories, your teaching experience, positions held, and your interest in early childhood education. So, you know, I guess why you're focusing on that specific area, why it's important to you, and then leading into how you're going to turn that into personal goals. So, and how you're starting to develop your philosophy of early childhood teaching around that specific area. So it says to identify key early childhood curriculum principles and pedagogy practices that currently shape your evolving philosophy. So actually, that would be more, I think, Yifang, where you would start talking about that, because it really is about how you're starting to develop specific, I guess, those of you that have been teaching for a while, you're developing areas, specialist areas. And for you, Yifang, that's probably, you know, you're really starting to think about that transition to school. That's important. That might be a factor that is important in your context at the moment. So I was talking to a student on Tuesday night who is a principal, and he wants to work collaboratively and make connections with the local kindergarten, the Creation Kindergarten, to assist with continuity and transition to school. And I was telling him, well, that's really exciting because I've got students, other fellow students of yours that are working in the other direction. So it's quite fascinating how there are so many connections with what you're doing. Does that help, Yifang?
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
So yeah, but the context does say that it must be in the birth to 8 years of age range, but we can work around that as long as the focus is on that pedagogical and curriculum aspects of birth to 8 years of age. Okay. Any questions at all about the part B, the third part, the professional development action plan? As I said to you, this will be something that's going to be completely different for all of you. So that's the template. It's an example, just one example. You don't have to use that. Some of you are using your actual PPR that you use in your schools, and I'm happy for you to do that, as long as it does have the majority of those headings, you know, that you would have anyway, the time frame, the rationale, links to curriculum and pedagogy, professional growth and critical reflection activities, resources and limitations. So it's fairly straightforward in terms of a professional development plan. Okay, I'll just check the chat to see if there are any other questions. We might finish up soon. So next, this is our last workshop, really, because next week we have a guest lecturer, one of our professors from early childhood, and she has done a recording for you. So there are readings and there's some videos to watch, and then the recording for you to watch as well. So I'm going to encourage you to post any insights or questions or observations onto the Padlet for next week. And then the week after, we are going to, it's not a formal session, but as we did last time, it's a drop-in session. So for you to, you'll be at a point then, I hope, where you're tidying things up and you have a very good idea of where you're going forward. And it will just be an opportunity for you to have a chat. You know, you might want to talk, share some insights with each other in terms of just finishing up that final assessment task. Any questions? No? Now we've got the evaluation survey coming up too for all of the units. So I would greatly appreciate if you took a few moments when you get that email to evaluate the unit and your learning experience, because I take these very seriously. Each year any of your suggestions or changes, I always think carefully about them and put them into practice. So the individual Zoom sessions and some things have come out of some of the previous evaluations as well, just because we have, you know, because I've got 70 students and we've got 15 here tonight in the Zoom session, which really makes me realize, and from talking to a lot of people as well, how limited everyone is with time. And so the Zoom sessions, especially for the second assessment task, were to try and give you that opportunity, that face-to-face, because we can email each other, but Zooming is so much better, especially when we can share the screen and look at your previous assessment task. So those of you who are watching the recording, please don't hesitate to contact me. I'm very happy to assist you in any way I can with those. So the main people, the people that I've actually emailed and asked if they wanted a Zoom session were those that hadn't done quite so well in their first assessment task. So that doesn't mean that you know, even if you've done very well, you might still need some assistance. So I don't want to assume that everything is smooth sailing for you. Okay, we might finish up if there are no final questions. And hopefully I will see some of you face-to-face in a Zoom session, but if not, I'll see you not next week, but the week after for some final support and discussion about your final assessment task. Okay, everyone, thank you very much. Good night. Bye to those of you at home watching the recording. How you doing, Katie?
I forgot to unmute then.
I'll just check. Kamiko, is everything okay? All good? Did you have a question?
Oh, all good. Thank you.
Okay. All right.
You have a good night.
Good night. We'll see you not next week, but the week after.
Sounds good. Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Ciao.
Just give me one moment.